In the pre-dawn blackness of August 16, 2005, the sky over western Venezuela held a secret. It was a terrible secret, wrapped in the form of a McDonnell Douglas MD-82 jetliner. The aircraft, designated West Caribbean Airways Flight 708, was falling. Inside, 152 passengers and 8 crew members were pinned to their seats by forces they could not comprehend. They were alive for this descent. The fall was a long one, lasting over 3 minutes from an altitude of more than 30,000 feet. It was a silent, inexorable journey downward through the thin, cold air. On the ground, near the town of Machiques, a farmer named Francisco Gonzalez was tending to his cattle. He heard a noise, a strange and violent roar that did not belong to the rural quiet of his world. He looked up. What he saw was a fireball, a brief and furious bloom of orange and red against the dark canvas of the sky. The sound that followed was immense, a concussive boom that rolled across the valley and shook the earth beneath his feet. The plane had struck the ground in a marshy, remote field. It did not skid or cartwheel, it simply disintegrated upon impact, the force of its vertical descent so great that it obliterated the machine and everything within it. West Caribbean Airways was not a titan of the skies. It was a small charter airline born in Colombia in 1998, operating with a fleet of aging, second-hand aircraft. Its business model was built on serving routes that larger carriers ignored, catering to tourists and charter groups seeking affordable travel. The airline's finances were perpetually strained. It flew on thin margins where every dollar counted. This financial pressure created a difficult operating environment. Maintenance schedules could be stretched and corners could be cut. The company had a history. It was a history marred by incidents that should have served as stark warnings. Just 5 months before the crash of Flight 708, another of the airline's planes, a LET L410 turboprop, had crashed shortly after taking off from the Colombian island of Providencia. That accident killed 8 of the 14 people on board. The crash brought intense scrutiny upon the airline. Colombia's Civil Aviation Authority began a special investigation into West Caribbean's operations. The UAEAC fined West Caribbean Airways $45,000 for multiple safety violations. These were not minor infractions. The list included pilots flying for more hours than regulations allowed, a lack of proper training documentation, and failures to report required safety information. By August 2005, only one of West Caribbean's 3 MD-82's was airworthy. The passengers of Flight 708 were almost all from Martinique, a French territory in the Caribbean. They were civil servants and their families returning from a week-long vacation in Panama. They were teachers, postal workers, and municipal employees. Their mood was likely one of pleasant exhaustion, the kind that follows a good holiday. They were laden with souvenirs and memories, ready to return to their island homes. The flight was delayed. Originally scheduled to depart Tocumen International Airport in Panama City earlier in the evening, Flight 708 did not push back from the gate until after midnight. Delays are common in air travel and rarely a cause for alarm. But for this flight, the delay would have subtle yet significant consequences. The crew, Captain Omar Ospina and First Officer David Munoz, were now operating on a later schedule. The crew was young. Captain Ospina was 40 but relatively inexperienced on the MD-82. First Officer Munoz was just 21, at the very beginning of his airline career. They were products of the West Caribbean system, a system under financial and regulatory pressure. The flight plan called for them to climb to 33,000 feet. It was a standard, fuel-efficient altitude for the MD-82 on a flight of this length. But on this night, with this specific aircraft weight and these specific atmospheric conditions, it would prove to be a fatal choice. The initial climb was uneventful. Flight 708 ascended smoothly through the lower layers of the atmosphere. The pilots communicated with air traffic control, their voices calm and professional. The problem began as the aircraft climbed higher, into the thinner, colder air. They had chosen a final cruising altitude of 33,000 feet. For an MD-82, this altitude is achievable, but it depends heavily on the aircraft's weight and the air temperature. On this particular night, the plane was heavy with passengers, luggage, and fuel. Furthermore, the air at high altitude was warmer than standard, which makes the air less dense and reduces engine performance. The plane was struggling to climb. As the jet approached its target altitude, another factor came into play: ice. At these heights, moisture in the air can instantly freeze onto the cold surfaces of an aircraft, particularly the leading edges of the wings and the engine inlets. To combat this, Planes are equipped with an anti-ice system which uses hot air bled from the engines to keep these critical surfaces clear. The pilots of Flight 708 turned their engine anti-ice system on. This action, while necessary for safety, had a crucial side effect. It diverted a significant amount of power from the engines. The already struggling engines now had even less thrust available to keep the plane climbing and maintain its speed. The aircraft was now in a precarious state. It was heavy, the air was thin, and the engines were producing reduced power. It was flying perilously close to its coffin corner, a term pilots use for a dangerous aerodynamic situation. This is a condition at high altitude where the stall speed and the maximum operating speed are very close together. The margin for error is razor thin. Flight 708 was flying on a knife's edge, and its pilot seemed unaware of the danger. The final element was the autopilot. The system was trying to do exactly what it was told: maintain a specific rate of climb to reach 33,000 feet. The first sign of critical danger was a sound. A loud, insistent horn began to blare in the cockpit. It was the stall warning. This is the plane's way of screaming that it is about to lose lift, that the wings are no longer able to support the aircraft's weight. The correct, ingrained response for any pilot is immediate and decisive. Push the nose down to decrease the angle of attack and increase airspeed, and apply maximum power. It is a fundamental rule of flying, but the pilots of Flight 708 did not do this. Instead, their reaction was one of confusion. The information from the cockpit voice recorder tells a harrowing story of two men completely misunderstanding their situation. Captain Ospina and First Officer Munoz believed the problem was not a stall, but the opposite. They thought both of their engines had failed, a condition known as a flameout. The captain, believing the engines were dead, pulled the nose up further. This was the single worst thing he could have done. He was trying to trade airspeed for altitude, a maneuver that might be used when gliding with no power. But the engines were not dead. They were simply unable to provide enough thrust in that configuration. The aircraft entered a deep stall. It was no longer flying but falling. The nose was pitched high, but the plane was descending at a terrifying rate of 12,000 feet per minute. They continued to pull back on the control column, holding the plane in the stall all the way down. They asked air traffic control for permission to descend, unaware they were already plummeting. The controllers, seeing the plane drop off their radar screens, could offer no help. The final moments on the voice recorder are of the pilot's frantic, futile efforts. Men trapped by a fatal misunderstanding until the very end. The investigation into the crash of Flight 708, led by Venezuela's Air Accident Investigation Board with assistance from France and the United States, quickly moved beyond the cockpit. The data from the black boxes told the what, but investigators needed to understand the why. Why were these pilots so confused? Why did they fail to recognize a classic aerodynamic stall? The answer was found not just in the final minutes of the flight, but in the months and years of the airline's operational history. The crash was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of a long and steady erosion of safety standards. West Caribbean Airways had created the conditions for its own demise. The airline's financial desperation was the root cause. A company struggling to make payroll is a company that will cut corners elsewhere. Maintenance was a primary area of concern. Investigators found evidence of deferred maintenance and a lack of spare parts. More critically, the financial strain directly impacted the crew. Pilots were reportedly overworked and underpaid. Pilot training was found to be severely deficient. The investigation revealed that West Caribbean Airways had not provided its MD-82 pilots with adequate simulator training for high-altitude stall recovery. Their training records were incomplete. They had likely never experienced or practiced the specific scenario they faced that night. They were unprepared for the complex cues of a high-altitude stall, where the physical sensations can be misleading. The impact of the crash on Martinique was profound and devastating. With a population of just under 400,000, the island is a tightly knit community. The loss of 152 of its people in a single event was a national trauma. Everyone on the island seemed to know someone or know someone who was on that flight. The victims were public servants, their families, their children. They were the fabric of the community. The grief was not abstract, it was personal and widespread. The families of the victims formed an association to demand answers, seek justice, and ensure that such a disaster would not happen again. They fought for years to have the full story told and to hold those responsible accountable. The lessons learned from Flight 708 reverberated throughout the aviation industry. reinforcing the critical importance of robust pilot training, especially for rare but catastrophic events like high-altitude stalls. In the end, the story of Flight 708 is a story of failure on every level. A corporate failure of an airline that put profit before people. A regulatory failure that allowed an unsafe airline to continue operating. And finally, a human failure in a dark cockpit over Venezuela. The empty field near Machiques is now reclaimed by nature, but the scars on the island of Martinique remain. They serve as a permanent memorial to the 160 lives lost, and a solemn warning of the terrible price of neglect.